Angel Reese arrived in Atlanta not as a fresh start, but as a controversy already in motion.
It's literally a dream come true to be a part of an organization that one really cares about their players.
The trade from the Chicago Sky carried weight that went well beyond statistics or contract terms. It arrived with a record, one that her new teammates were more than familiar with and more than willing to discuss. The introductory press conference, which in most professional sports contexts serves as an exercise in diplomacy and optimism, became instead an unusually candid public accounting of a player's professional reputation. Before the Atlanta Dream had played a single minute together with their new acquisition, the room had already been given a clear-eyed assessment of what she was and was not capable of doing on a basketball court. That kind of opening is rare in professional sports. Teams invest considerable energy in managing perceptions during transitions, especially when the player in question commands the level of public attention that Reese does. The standard protocol calls for measured praise, generalized excitement, and carefully constructed statements about the future. What Atlanta's veterans offered instead was something closer to testimony. To understand why that press conference unfolded the way it did, it is necessary to look at what the Chicago Sky had become in the period leading up to the trade, and what Reese's tenure there ultimately produced. Chicago acquired Reese with expectations that were both reasonable and commercially motivated. She was, by measurable standards, a force on the glass. Her rebounding numbers were among the best in the league. She generated attention, sold merchandise, and gave the franchise a marketable identity at a time when the WNBA was undergoing one of the most significant expansions of its media footprint in decades. On those terms, the experiment had a logic to it. What the statistics did not capture, and what became increasingly apparent over the course of her time in Chicago, was the effect her presence had on the organization's internal environment. The Sky did not improve. By most evaluations, they declined. Not in a gradual, rebuilding sense, but in the sharper way that suggests something structural was wrong. Teams lose for many reasons: injuries, roster imbalances, coaching transitions, poor drafting. But the Sky's trajectory during this period raised questions that went beyond those conventional explanations. The suspension that Reese received for conduct detrimental to the team was, in the context of professional basketball, a significant event. Teams do not suspend players of her commercial value over minor disagreements or isolated incidents. The decision to impose that kind of sanction, publicly, formally, signals that the organization has exhausted other options and determined that the cost of inaction outweighs the cost of the controversy a suspension will generate. It is an organizational last resort. That it happened with a player as commercially prominent as Reese only underscores how seriously the front office had taken the internal situation. Around the same time, a separate narrative was developing in the media, one that placed Reese's commitment to the physical demands of professional basketball in question. Reports and social media observations drew attention to her public activity during periods when she was listed as dealing with a back injury. The juxtaposition, a player sidelined from competition while visibly active in other contexts, did not go unnoticed by those covering the league. For an organization already managing internal friction, it added another layer of difficulty. The trade, when it came, was not a surprise to those paying close attention. What was perhaps more notable was what happened immediately afterward in Chicago. The Sky moved with a speed and purpose that suggested the decision had been long in the making. Within a short window following the trade, the organization signed Skylar Diggins-Smith and several other veteran players, reconfiguring its roster in ways that had been apparently impossible while the previous arrangement was in place. Whether those signings were contingent on the trade or whether they simply reflected priorities that could now be acted upon, the result was a roster that by most evaluations looked more coherent and more competitive than anything Chicago had fielded in the preceding 2 years. The detail that generated the most commentary, however, was the jersey number. Before the paperwork on the trade had time to settle, the number 5 was reassigned, given to Rickea Jackson. In the culture of professional sports, jersey numbers carry symbolic weight. Retiring a number is an act of honor. Reassigning one promptly is something else. It communicates an organizational decision about legacy, about what is worth preserving and what is not. The speed with which Chicago acted on that detail told its own story, distinct from any official statement. Taken together, the trade, the swift roster reconstruction, the jersey reassignment, the message from the Chicago organization was legible without requiring interpretation. They were not managing a transition. They were executing a reset. In Atlanta, the situation Reese was entering was its own complicated landscape. The Dream have been a franchise in search of stability for several years. They have talent. Rhyne Howard is one of the more complete players in the league, and the core around her has shown flashes of genuine competitive capability. But the Dream have not translated that talent into postseason success, and the addition of Reese was framed, at least publicly, as a move that could change that. The press conference, however, suggested that the internal view was more complicated. When Rhyne Howard spoke about facing Reese in competition, she did not deploy the diplomatic language that usually governs those moments. Instead, she described her experience guarding Reese as a favorable one, specifically as an opportunity for her own statistical production. The implication was direct. Reese had presented a manageable defensive challenge. That this was said publicly at an event designed to welcome Reese to the organization was a departure from standard professional practice that observers immediately recognized. Alicia Gray's remarks followed in a similar register. The Atlanta veterans collectively communicated something that press conference settings are specifically designed to prevent: an honest appraisal of a new teammate's limitations. They were not hostile. They were not inflammatory in tone. They were, however, candid in a way that carried its own message. They had played against this player. They had, by their own account, found it manageable. Now she was on their team. The distinction matters because it cuts to the center of what the Dream are actually acquiring. Reese's value proposition has always rested substantially on her rebounding and her commercial profile. Her defensive limitations have been documented by analysts and coaches for some time. In a league that is becoming more sophisticated in how it uses analytics to evaluate positional defense and rotational responsibility, a player who struggles to contain elite scorers represents a specific kind of liability, one that opponents can and do identify and target. That the Dream's own players were willing to say this in public on the day of her introduction reflects either an unusual organizational culture around transparency or a degree of frustration that had not been fully managed before the cameras were rolling. Either way, it was a notable moment. The Courtney Vandersloot situation provides necessary context for understanding how Reese's professional reputation developed the way it did. Vandersloot is one of the most decorated players in WNBA history. Her career statistics, her postseason record, and her standing among peers represent a kind of institutional credibility that is difficult to build and very easy to damage. When comments attributed to Reese characterizing Vandersloot's age and relevance in unflattering terms circulated in the media, the response within the league was significant. Professional athletes in team sports understand, at a functional level, that criticism of teammates or former teammates has consequences beyond the immediate moment. It affects trust. It affects the willingness of veterans to invest in younger players, to cover for their mistakes, to advocate for them in coaching staff conversations. When a younger player is perceived as willing to undermine a respected veteran publicly for the purpose of positioning, whether for attention, for leverage, or simply out of poor judgment, that perception follows them. It becomes part of how they are categorized. Naz Hillman's use of the word annoying to describe Reese operated in that same register. In casual usage, annoying is a minor descriptor. In the context of professional team sports, where the word is being applied to a colleague by another professional, it has a specific meaning. It describes a person whose presence in a working environment creates friction, whose energy, behavior, or conduct makes the collective task more difficult rather than less. That is a serious professional characterization, and the fact that it was offered publicly by a peer about a player now entering a new organization added weight to the Atlanta press conference's overall atmosphere. What the cumulative record of Reese's time in Chicago suggests is not simply a player who struggled in some areas while excelling in others. That description applies to nearly every professional athlete. What it suggests, rather, is a player whose relationship with the professional environment around her generated consistent conflict, and whose response to that conflict prioritized individual positioning over collective resolution. That pattern is not invisible to other organizations. The WNBA operates as a relatively small professional league. Players, coaches, and front office personnel know each other. Information about locker room dynamics, about a player's conduct during adversity, about how a person handles the unglamorous demands of professional competition, that information circulates. It shapes how organizations evaluate acquisitions. Atlanta, in choosing to make this trade, made a calculation. They determined that Reese's capabilities, her rebounding, her physical presence, her ability to draw attention and revenue, outweighed the record that accompanied her. That is a defensible organizational decision. Teams make those calculations regularly. Players with difficult professional histories perform at high levels for new organizations all the time, when the fit is right and when the player in question is willing to adapt. The question that the press conference raised, and that the 2026 season will begin to answer, is whether the conditions for that kind of adaptation exist in Atlanta. The fit, on paper, is not obvious. Howard has established herself as the team's primary scoring option and its most credible defensive presence. The dream system has been built, in meaningful ways, around her capabilities, integrating a player who requires significant touches, who has known defensive limitations, and who arrives carrying the freight of a public professional dispute, requires careful management of rotations, of media, and of interpersonal dynamics within the team. The Indiana Fever situation adds a further layer of pressure. Indiana, led by Caitlin Clark, has been building steadily. Clark's arrival in the league generated levels of attention unprecedented in the WNBA's recent history, and the franchise has invested in surrounding her with a roster capable of translating that attention into competitive results. The Fever handled Atlanta in at least one meaningful matchup during the previous season, doing so without being at full strength. A healthy Indiana team in the 2026 season represents one of the most significant competitive challenges in the Eastern Conference. Clark's offensive capabilities are well documented. Her ability to operate in pick-and-roll actions, to shoot off movement, and to create advantages at the point of attack put specific demands on opposing defenses. A defensive liability in the lineup, a player who elite scorers identify as a preferred target, is not an abstract concern when facing that kind of opponent. It is a game-planning priority. The Dream will have to make choices about how to deploy Reese in those matchups. Those choices will carry consequences regardless of how they are made. Playing her in standard rotations exposes a known weakness to a team that has demonstrated the sophistication to exploit it. Limiting her minutes or role creates its own set of complications, given the terms on which she was acquired and the expectations her presence generates. There is also the question of what chemistry means in practical terms for a professional basketball team, and why it matters in ways that are sometimes undervalued in external analysis. Chemistry in team sports is not primarily about whether players enjoy each other's company. It is about whether players trust each other's decision-making under competitive pressure, whether they can anticipate each other's movements, whether the communication on a defensive rotation or a fast break happens at the speed the game demands, or whether it breaks down because the underlying trust is not there. Teams that win consistently, not occasionally, not in isolated games, but across a season and into the postseason, do so in large part because their players have built a functional operating trust. That trust is difficult to manufacture and easy to damage. The Atlanta veterans who spoke at that press conference may have been more candid than the organization intended, but what they were communicating, beneath the specific comments about defense and matchup history, was something about trust, about whether they knew what they were getting, and whether what they were getting was compatible with what they were trying to build. Whether the Dream's front office adequately accounted for that dynamic in making this trade is a question that will not have a clean answer until the season is well underway. What is already clear is that the circumstances surrounding Reese's move to Atlanta are not typical. The departure from Chicago was not a mutual, professionally managed transition. It was marked by conflict, by organizational action, by a rapid and deliberate reorientation of the franchise away from the identity she had come to represent. The reception in Atlanta was not the standard professional welcome. It was qualified, complicated, and in some moments openly skeptical. None of that means the arrangement cannot work. Athletes have overcome more difficult starting conditions. Organizations have successfully integrated players who arrived under precisely this kind of cloud. What it requires in those cases is a willingness on all sides to prioritize the collective goal above the individual narrative, to do the work away from cameras that makes a team function. The concern, based on the available record, is whether that willingness is present here. The conduct in Chicago that led to the suspension, the conduct toward Vandersloot that fractured locker room relationships, the pattern of placing individual positioning ahead of collective management, these are not simply matters of personality or style. They reflect decisions, and decisions made consistently, across different environments and relationships, become patterns that are very difficult to separate from a player's professional identity. The 2026 season will test that. Atlanta will play a full schedule, face its competitors, manage its internal dynamics publicly and privately, and at some point arrive at the playoffs, or not, with whatever they have built or failed to build by then. The numbers Reese produces, the rebounds, the points in the paint, the physical presence she brings on a nightly basis will be visible and measurable. What will be harder to measure but equally consequential is whether the dream function as a coherent unit, whether the veterans who were so candid at that press conference find a workable professional relationship with their new teammate, and whether the league's increasingly sophisticated defenses can be answered by an offense that Reese meaningfully improves rather than complicates. Chicago's rapid turnaround will itself be a data point. If the Sky, no longer organized around Reese's role, develop into a more competitive and stable organization in 2026, that outcome will reflect on the preceding period in ways that are difficult to argue with. Organizations do not typically improve this quickly after losing a central player unless the arrangement being dissolved was itself a limitation. If Chicago's new roster performs at a high level, the implication already suggested by the speed with which they acted after the trade is that the previous arrangement had been restraining rather than enabling the franchise's potential. That would be a significant verdict, arrived at not through commentary or criticism but through results on the court. For Reese, the 2026 season is not simply another year. It is a moment that will likely define the trajectory of her professional reputation for some time. She is still in the early stage of her career. She has time to develop, to address the limitations her teammates and opponents have identified, and to rebuild the professional relationships that have been strained or broken. That work, if it happens, will not generate the same volume of attention as the controversies that preceded it. It rarely does. But it is the only work that ultimately matters in professional team sports. The question that the Atlanta press conference left hanging in the room, and that the season ahead will begin to answer, is whether Angel Reese is prepared to do it.